This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Martin Popoff, author of Anthem, Rush in the 70s. With extensive first-hand reflections from Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, as well as from family, friends, and fellow musicians, Anthem, Rush in the 70s is a detailed portrait of Canada's greatest rock ambassadors. Anthem puts the band's catalog from their self-titled debut to 1978's Hemispheres into both Canadian and general pop culture context, and presents the trio of quintessentially dependable, courteous Canucks as generators of incendiary, groundbreaking rock and roll. Fighting complacency, provoking thought, and often enraging critics, Rush has been at war with the music industry since 1974, when they were first dismissed as the Led Zeppelin of the North. Anthem, like each volume in the series, celebrates the perseverance of Geddy, Alex, and Neil, three men who maintained their values while operating from a Canadian base throughout lean years, personal tragedies, and the band's eventual worldwide success. Martin Popoff has written close to 100 books on hard rock, heavy metal, classic rock, and record collecting. He was editor-in-chief of the now-retired Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, Canada's foremost heavy metal publication in print for 14 years, and has also contributed to Revolver, Guitar World, Goldmine, Record Collector, BraveWords.com, Lollipop.com, and HardRadio.com. He's been a regular contractor to Banger Films, having worked on the award-winning documentary Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage, the 11-episode Metal Evolution, and the 10-episode Rock Icons, both for VH1 Classic. He currently resides in Toronto, and you can reach him through Martin P. at inforamp.net or through his website, martinpopoff.com. This interview was originally recorded around January of 2020 for my previous podcast, Discovery. This was shortly after the passing of Rush drummer Neil Peart. Martin is one of my favorite guests. I've had the chance to interview him a handful of times, and he's always great. And in this particular interview, he talks extensively about Neil Peart and his recent passing. That follows with a discussion of Rush in the 70s. It's part of Martin's three-book Across the Decades series on Rush. There is no better guy to talk Rush with than Martin. So let's get to it. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Martin, thanks for being here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, Eric. This is very cool.
First, your thoughts on Neil Peart's passing, the kind of person he was, what you'll remember most about him as a person before we get to him with his talents.
Yeah, I mean, I was completely shocked. I was not in the know. I knew nothing about it. I found out when everybody else found out about it. I had no idea he was sick at all. And then, word came out. I mean, it goes all the way back to the retirement. So essentially the retirement time is when this all started. So I assume it seems like it had bearing on the whole thing, on Rush's retirement. What kind of person he was it's pretty interesting. I mean, I really do feel that probably the greatest thing Neil did is, well, Neil inspired, millions of fans around the world, even just with his literary skills and to be serious and thoughtful, let alone the drumming. But I think one of the great things he did is he helped Geddy and Alex become Renaissance men, because who knows if their path was really taking them in that direction. I mean, Neil came into the band and blew them away with their drumming, but he also blew them away with I remember one of the quote being, he reads books, right? And boy, this guy could write our lyrics, because they showed no super propensity to do that. And I think having this drummer blow into their lives and push them as musicians, and also push them as thinking men, and then all of his interests along the way, the bike riding and the motorcycling and the literary hobby, the reading. These guys did not end up going to college, and I think there was always that little chip on their shoulder that, okay, we didn't go get our formal training. Let's put ourselves through school. Let's homeschool ourselves. And essentially, when Neil came in, I think he was the catalyst for, like I say, the beautiful situation of both Alex and Geddy becoming Renaissance men in their own rights. So I think Neil basically made those two guys much more complex and interesting people and family men and everything. Just the whole ball of wax. Even just what the band embodies is being Renaissance men in terms of having the literary angle and the craft and the great production in that. But yeah, I think that's one of the great things that Neil did, is he basically really helped Geddy and Alex become, super complete, well-respected people.
How many times did you get a chance to interview Neil?
Just once in person, a long in person. When we did the first Rush book, it was an authorized book through it was through a publisher, but basically it was the authorized Rush biography.
Okay.
And then Geddy and Alex many times. But basically, when that book came out, when I went back and looked at it, I was like kind of shocked about how short it is. It's like a 66,000 word book. It's kind of half picture book and half words. I mean, it's more than there had ever been, but as a biography goes, there's not much to it. And then, yes, later we did Rush the Illustrated History, which is even a shorter book. I think it was like 36,000 words and even more pictures. And then we did Rush album by album, which is a whole different thing, where I did 5 in that series, where you get sort of experts and famous people, as famous as you can get, to be on a little panel, and you get 2 or 3 of them talking about each studio album, and you go through that. So that's why I was able to do this new thing that's coming out.
So that time you spoke with him, the reputation that he had was he was shy, didn't like to talk a lot. Was it difficult to get him to open up?
No, that's the other cool thing about Neil. And I have this theory about interviewing people. Some people, I think some people don't like being interviewed because they realize they don't have a lot to say about what they're doing. They're not very introspective. They're maybe not very intellectually curious. I was struck by that when Prince went on Oprah and got interviewed. I thought, well, this is why Prince doesn't do interviews. And then other people, I think, don't like doing interviews. And so this is a little different than the sort of normal thing about Neil. I mean, the normal story is Neil doesn't like doing interviews because, well, the one thing is, after, the horrible tragedies that befell his daughter Selena and then Jackie dying 10 months later, he had a lot of grief in his life, and he certainly didn't want to get asked about that. And he's a private guy and doesn't want to be asked about personal things. But before that, before 97, he actually did do a lot of the interviews for the band. And he didn't like getting asked about Ayn Rand and the whole, starting to go into this whole, he read a lot of stuff, and this is one thing he read early and he wrote about it. And it's, this cult of selfishness and libertarianism and all that, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing that Neil doesn't like is he doesn't take compliments well, and he just doesn't want to be told how great he is all the time. It's not a conversation. It's a one-way thing, and he's got nothing to say to that, right? So, but the other thing with Neil, I think, and this is what I found with a lot of people who don't really want to get interviewed too often, is that you get him talking, and he loves talking, and he puts himself in it so much. So I swear there are a lot of people I interviewed that don't do a lot of interviews because they're just worn out after it, and they take way too long, and they probably think they've said some things that are more personal than they should have said, or they might have ticked someone off because they just throw themselves into it. And Neil was kind of like that. We noticed that, with Sam and Scott when we were doing the movie. I mean, Neil, once you get him going, he loves talking. He's a great talker. He's super sociable. But he strikes me as one of these guys that somewhere, maybe even just subconsciously in his head, he told himself at one time, I can't do interviews because that 15-minute slot, I'm going to turn it into an hour and a half, and I don't have an hour and a half. I'm going to tick off everybody else who's waiting, and I'm going to wear out my voice, and I'm just going to wear myself out. So to answer your question, short story long, he was a great interview, and he had a lot to say. And, I never felt the need later on in life to interview him lots of times because this was the all-encompassing. I got to ask him everything I wanted to because we were actually doing it for the book. He knew it was for the book. So it was a massive career retrospective situation. And then later on, when albums would come out and stuff, it was never offered to us anyways. It was always, do you want Geddy or do you want Alex? And so you picked one, right? So yeah, it was a great situation. And then, like I say, over the years, I talked to the other guys a fair number of times.
For those who may not know, he lost his daughter first, sadly. She was a freshman in college. I believe she was driving to school or from school and died in a car accident. And then his wife, she lost a battle with cancer, correct?
Yeah, and then, the heartbreaking thing is when Neil said she didn't die of cancer. She died of a broken heart. their only child, Selena, 19 years old, dies on the 401, a highway. Every time I drive up and down it, I always think about it at that spot. It's just a desolate spot, along this long, massive, huge highway, one of the biggest highways in the world in terms of, well, when it crosses Toronto, it's actually one of the busiest highways in the whole world, right? It's a long, long highway that links Toronto through Kingston, which is roughly where, this accident took place. Ottawa off to the side on the way to Montreal. And of course, on the way to Montreal, they had the country home. And this is where, the Great Le Studio was, north of Montreal, where they recorded, some of those classic albums, right?
And you talked about getting him to open up. And I recently heard Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater. He was on Chris Jericho's podcast. They were sharing their stories about Neil after his passing. And he talked about how if you talked to Neil about, and this is just what you pointed out, if you talked to him about drumming, he would be turned off. He didn't want to talk about that. Didn't want to hear how great he is. But if you talk to him about other things, traveling, wine, motorcycles, normal person stuff, you'd have a much better chance of getting him to open up. And he said, and Portnoy said that's how he got in his inner circle. Not because Portnoy himself is a great drummer. It wasn't that at all. It was just two guys connecting. And I think that speaks a lot to Neil's personality.
Yeah, and the other sort of subtext of what you just said is that Neil is always, very intellectually curious, moving forward all the time. So why would he want to talk about drumming? I mean, he's basically, a lot of people consider him the greatest drummer in the world. And that's a silly thing to say, but once you start combining the craft with the memorability and the hookiness and the pioneeringness and all these other things he did, plus, the bonus is he's a lyricist on the side. There's a lot to be said for coming up with something as grand as that, greatest drummer of all time. Because, greatest of anything in this respect, it's art, it's subjective, but if you want to challenge yourself and say, how can we actually come up with this measurement, you might want to treat it as a package, right? A package is what was your impact? How much joy did you bring to people? How memorable is what you've done? How many tickets did you sell? How often are you on the radio? How many records did you sell? How crazy is your craft? How crazy was your drum set? Did you explore electronic drums and acoustic drums? Did you explore percussion? Did you have glockenspiels and bells and triangles and every kind of cymbal imaginable? Did you talk to drum magazines all the time? So Neil did all these things. So I've never really thought about this, but hearing Ray Daniels, the manager, say, "Oh, Neil, people think he's the greatest drummer of all time," or maybe even going so bold as to say he was the greatest drummer of all time, you think, that's Rush's manager saying it. But if you look at the entire package, there's a lot of credence to calling him the greatest drummer of all time.
Most figured that Neil was a super serious guy. I guess those who are on the outside, not the hardcore Rush fans who got to know him pretty well through all the information that they got from folks like yourself and the great books on Rush and documentaries. But he had the same sense of humor as Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, that kind of off-the-wall humor. It's just that he only showed it to people that he was comfortable being around. There were those home movies they made, but he was a guy who had a sense of humor.
Yeah, and the whole band did, and yeah, they didn't mind laughing themselves. I mean, I'm sure they thought, being sort of well-grounded Canadian guys, they probably just saw this whole career that they were into as surreal, as a lark in a way. I mean, they were serious about it, but they were basically always thankful for what they had, and almost incredulous that they could be, so well loved and respected around the world.
His shyness. He could have said, you know what, I've had enough of this. I can't deal with being in the limelight. What was the lyric? I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend. Meeting fans, doing interviews, being in the spotlight. He could have, I suppose, gone the other way, quit the business, maybe turn to drugs or alcohol to cope. Was it having two understanding bandmates like Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson with him a reason why he was able to remain grounded throughout it, navigate his way through all that craziness? Because they seem to be real respectful of his wishes to avoid fan meet and greets and things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, I something that comes to mind just this idea of being a trio. Now, being a trio, normally guys that are in trios talk about how it's always easy to come up with a decision because it's always 2 against 1. There's negatives to that, but the other thing about being a trio is there's only 3 guys, so I think everybody has to be super respectful of each other. And it's I just feel like they knew what they had in Neil. It's odd for the most the most interesting, recognizable, celebrated instrument in a band to be the drums, number one. And number two, Rush's lyrics attracted a ton of attention. So the lyrics were a huge thing. And one of the beautiful things about the lyrics, I always thought, is that, a little more so than Geezer's lyrics in Ozzy's mouth, a lot more so, Neil's lyrics in Geddy's mouth, they just sound so perfect coming from Geddy, because they are both, like I say, Renaissance men, but they're both, I don't know, I don't want to say stress too much, like, say, the atheism side of things, but also the just the social consciousness, just the general intellectual qualities. I mean, basically, it was quite an art to have Geddy sing all those lyrics across all those albums, and them basically sounding like something Geddy would think anyways. As time goes on, we also learned, though, that Geddy, again, partially through his own ambition and drive, and I think Neil being an inspiration, became a thoughtful, intellectual guy himself who could have had no problem writing the lyrics. I think it just became a kind of a cool custom after a while that okay, Neil will write the lyrics. But Geddy had a lot to say about the lyrics, and he would throw out lines that he thought wouldn't apply to him or that he wouldn't say. So there was a lot of massaging and crafting along the way. So I think Geddy really does put the stamp on them. But yeah, it's just really cool that that Neil could speak for the band, Alex as well, and just the whole concept of Rush, and maybe, like I say, even a certain Canadianness. I just think they always were very respectful, because they're just respectful, good guys anyways. They're good, down to earth guys. They were all respectful of each other's wishes, but yeah, I imagine they realized, and they've always said this, they were always adamant. I mean, there's no Rush without him. When he was possibly going to never come back, it was just, there was never a question that they were going to be Rush without Neil. And people talk about, oh, what if Mike Portnoy was the new drummer for Rush or went in there or whatever? I think I can see, because Geddy and Alex are good buddies, I could see them being making music again together. But what I would want them to do, or what I would hope they would do, is join a 4-piece band. And not be a trio, number one, because you don't want the comparisons with Rush. And also, frankly, I wouldn't mind. Geddy probably is worrying about the limitations of his singing at this stage in life. So I think it would be wild if he got into a band and he wasn't even the lead singer. That would be really cool. So
wow, yeah.
So it'd be pretty cool to see those two guys in a 4-piece and Geddy not even being the singer. And I always draw the comparison to Led Zeppelin when they didn't bring John Paul Jones in. Now, I don't know exactly the politics that went down there, but when they made Page Plant. I'm not talking about a reunion with Jason Bonham or anything like that. I'm talking about when they made Page Plant. They didn't bring John Paul Jones in, because then it's 3 out of 4, and that's kind of awkward. There is the comparison. I could almost see those guys saying, the only way we can work together is if we make a new band. And if we brought John Paul Jones in, it would look way too much like Led Zeppelin and sound like Led Zeppelin probably. So we've got to do it this way. Let's be Page Plant. Now, frankly, I think Walking into Clarksdale is the great lost Led Zeppelin album. I almost like it more than I like it probably more than half the Led Zeppelin albums. Yeah, I just love that record. That's why I think, I would love to see those guys work again together, but in a 4-piece and without Geddy singing. Just get in a band with one word as its name and just go for it.
I didn't know this. Just recently, I heard Jericho also talk on his podcast talking about Neil only went to the front of the stage once, and that was at Rush's very last concert ever. He took a bow with his bandmates, but he would usually just run off the stage once the show was over. Is that true?
Yeah, and everybody looked at themselves, all the Rush fans in LA there, and said, "Wow, this is kind of different." Talk about a pretty interesting and mysterious and cool way to to close out your career, right?
The first Rush show I went to, I'll never forget just looking around me and I see all these fans, they're writing something, they're looking down writing. And I'm like, what the hell are they doing? And then my friend who I'm with, he's writing stuff down. I said, what are you doing? Oh, I'm writing down the set list. So we're going to post it on the internet. The fans just love to get into the set list, the band, everything about the band. They have a great fan base.
Yeah, and you saw that at the Rush cons, the Rush conventions, and I wish they would keep doing them. I've been at a few different ones and been a speaker and stuff at them and had a table of books and stuff. And yeah, you just notice that the fans are all, very capable people with very good jobs, and they're all really smart people. And so there's Neil again, inspiring, these millions of fans to be, in their own modest way, Renaissance people.
When did you become a fan of Rush? First Rush show, first Rush song you remember hearing?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it would have been with the first album. Might have been with the second album, but I'm pretty sure it was the first album. So I would have been 11 years old. I'm by 11. I pretty much was had my fingers in all these records pies. Like I knew what was going on. Cream magazine and Circus and stuff. Certainly by 12. So 70. No, by 12 we were well into it. So yeah, 74. I'm sure we would have had the Rush album at that time. My earliest memory really is being ready, with your two fingers on the record and play button when Creme FM Spokane, Washington was, had announced they were going to play the whole new Rush album, 2112, in its entirety. So I taped it off the radio right away. So, we were already well along Rush fans at that. But that's my earliest memory of those guys. And then I didn't see them for many, many years. I'm not a big concert guy. Plus, I grew up in a small town, so we didn't get a lot of concerts when I was a kid. We would have to go to Spokane, Washington for concerts, so they were few and far between. But no, I didn't see them for years after that. And then I've only seen them a few times. I'm notorious for, if I've seen a band once, I never need to see them again. I'm not the guy who wants to go over and over and over to see bands live. I just feel live is just a strange waste of time, especially in the YouTube age where you just watch the whole thing on YouTube, including things from the 60s and 70s and whatever. So I just the appeal of going to concerts is pretty low for me.
Since the book centers around the band in the 70s, we'll stick to that decade. Let's start with the beginning. The first thing is the band name. The story is that the original drummer, John Rutsey, named the band Rush based on a suggestion from his older brother. As to how or why his brother came up with it is a bit of a mystery. So some sources say it was because every gig the band played, they were always late, in a rush to get to the gig, or it came just before the band's first gig. It was in a basement of a church, and they had to scramble for a name. Then, of course, you have the absurd theories, like the name means ruling under Satan's house or ruled under Satan's hand. Of course, you always have to have those theories. Is there a definitive story behind why that name was chosen?
Yeah, I've never heard the acronym stuff, and I've never heard the being in a rush stuff. It was. I've heard that story about the brother, and I've heard them just talk about it, that it was a good name. It was short. It is a great name for a band. And the funny thing is, there was also a Mahogany Rush, and one of Neil's, just adjacent recent bands was called Hush. So, and then you hear the stories about them pulling into town and the promoter thinking they're getting Tom Rush, the folk singer, right? Getting that story. So yeah, it's a great name for a band, that's for sure. And the band's origins, people forget this, but the first album is 74, but their roots go back to 68, 69. I mean, they're a fully functioning rockin' along band by 70, 71, and essentially steady lineup with a few different people in there. But so it's a lot like Judas Priest, right? Judas Priest is the same thing. 69, founded 69, first album 74. Rush is the same thing.
The Led Zeppelin Comparison. I remember the story about WMMR in Cleveland. They played Working Man back in 74, and listeners calling in thinking it was Led Zeppelin. I would compare it more to that of Black Sabbath. Definitely
in Working Man, I hear Sabbath more so because it's a very Sabbath type riff. And Geddy's voice, as a kid, we had very strong opinions about vocals and certain, like I remember we never liked the Ramones very much because the vocal sounded like a novelty vocal. Geddy always gets accused of being kind of a novelty vocal, but I've never once thought his voice sounded anything like Robert Plant. I mean, he throws off the odd ooh yeah or whatever. So he can sing a little bit like Robert Plant occasionally, at the very beginning, but his voice sounds nothing like Robert Plant. So that's the crazy part. I just never saw that comparison. But across that whole album, yeah, you do get a bit of a Zeppelin vibe about it. There's some jamminess and, just in the variety of songs that are on there.
Neil replaced the original drummer John Rutsey around 74 or 75. Neil didn't just replace him on drums. Of course, he became the band's main lyricist. If Neil never joined the band, what do you think would have become of Rush? Would they still have that legendary status that they now have today?
No, I mean, I really think, they had a wholesale change. I mean, they essentially, with Fly By Night, invented progressive metal. I mean, that it's so clear to me that, people will bring up Kansas or King Crimson with 21st Century Schizoid Man, or The Who, or Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin with the variety, The Who with the propensity to the concept album and stuff like that. But, I mean, this was basically taking progressive rock and heavy metal and jamming them together like a Reese's peanut butter cup. I mean, it was literally a new genre of music that was invented with Fly By Night, just super clear. And so, yeah, no, would they have? Yeah, this is really one of those situations where would they have fallen into records like Fly By Night and Caress of Steel and 2112 without Neil? Absolutely not. I mean, they had no idea they were going to that place before Neil arrived. To take Dave Lombardo's word away from him, he was definitely a drum tornado. He was a tornado that just blew into that situation and changed it wholesale.
And Fly By Night from 75, first album where Neil is writing the lyrics. The title track is a classic. Your thoughts on the album as a whole and the title track Fly By Night?
Well, the album as a whole, like I say, it's a pioneering thing. And the track, it's interesting. This is another thing I think about Neil, that he's essentially the Beatles of drummers. He's the guy who writes songs on the drums. So when they even play like a poppy song like Fly By Night, this is a band that does what, New York musicians or critically acclaimed musicians would say is in bad taste, and they're overplaying or whatever, right? That's the big debate, right? When you hear it on a poppy song like that, it's an up-tempo pop song. It's not a ballad, but you hear the whole band doing like unison. Geddy and Neil will do unison fills at the end of the song and stuff. So, but Neil is throwing in these drum hooks. These fills are hooks, and that's why he's the most air-drummed drummer in the world, right? So that's the cool thing about a song like that, or Closer to the Heart, is that you hear this thing about Neil being a songwriter on the drums, and that's the other reason he's so important and so memorable and the most air-drummed drummer, because his fills are actually, little 12 or 17-second songs.
Caress of Steel, also from 75. 2 albums in 1 year.
Yeah, and a lot of bands did that, Kiss and Grand Funk, I think of, and, Saxon, even in the early 80s. I'm working on a Saxon book right now, so it happens occasionally. Normally, you don't get 2 albums in the same year over and over again, and I believe that's the only time it happened with Rush, although, then people are throwing in live albums and stuff. So that whole 70s period, yeah, they were super productive. They made a lot of albums in a row and then toured constantly around them.
And they made the transition from blues rock to more of the progressive rock on that album, would you say, right? Caress of Steel?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, I look at it almost as like the demo version of 2112 or the sort of setup to 2112. It is darker and a little more obscure, but I think the gulf between them is not as high as people say. I mean, I don't think 2112 is vastly superior to Caress of Steel. I think they're in the same wheelhouse, and even in the same wheelhouse as Fly By Night. But Fly By Night is just, it's interesting in that it's got 2 or 3 little "I think I'm going balls" on it, or what would see 2112 I suppose doesn't have anything particularly like that, but so it has 2 or 3 old timey rock and roll boogie woogie songs, whereas you're down to like 1 or 2 on Caress of Steel, and the rest is crazy prog.
Then we get to 2112, released in 76. This is the band's breakthrough, the one that saved them from being dropped by the label right after Caress of Steel failed to reach the label's expectations. Is 2112 Rush's greatest album?
It's definitely considered by many to be the greatest of the 70s, but I would say, my favorite is probably Hemispheres of the 70s, and then Permanent Waves. But it is the big breakthrough one. It's the one that went gold. And basically, from that point forward, Rush was allowed to do whatever they wanted to, and they were never going to let the label or management hear what they were doing, kind of thing. So it's where the confidence coalesced for them, where they basically said, we have a concept here. We have enough fans for this concept. We're just going to keep doing this, even if our fan base doesn't grow exponentially. We actually have a little cottage industry here, whereas on the last record, we kind of didn't even have enough to have a cottage industry.
The Twilight Zone is one of my favorite songs. It's an obscure song, but I love it because I'm a huge fan of the show. Neil wrote around 2 episodes of the classic 60s show. I'm not surprised that he was a fan as well, because that touched on all of the things that he would touch on lyrically, like the things that humans still connect with all these years later. Human condition, questioning our own existence. He really loved to explore the big questions that we all have.
Yeah, and that is a cool obscure song. And then the other thing people keep forgetting is that it's only half of a concept album, right? Only the one side is a concept thing. So they never actually made a full concept album until Clockwork Angels, right? But the other thing I like about that album is I think the production is better. It's more filled in than it was on Caress of Steel. I think Fly By Night's production is actually even a little better than Caress of Steel's. But on 2112, it's just very high fidelity. There's a correct amount of bass and treble. Neil's drums sound gorgeous. So yeah, I think they pulled it all together there, and it was still a time when prog was big. And again, this was a band with a distinction, with a short elevator pitch of being, we took the heavy metal and we took the prog and we put the two together.
And you focus on Temples of Syrinx in your podcast as one of the standout songs. It's a song about rediscovering music, correct?
Yeah, it's the start of the 2112 thing after Overture, and what I always loved about it as a kid. I mean, I was a drummer too, and as a kid, it has that great swooping fill in it. But basically, it's probably their greatest heavy metal song, really, if you think about it. It probably is. I've never thought about it that way because they really subtly change after that record, and they start. Alex doesn't think in a heavy metal way ever again. Even on a pretty heavy album like the last one, Clockwork Angels, he's got a strange, different writing style that's kind of like big and bluesy and black and maybe a bit grungy and tribal. He never thinks in a heavy metal like a Bastille Day heavy metal or a What You're Doing, or like I say, Temples of Syrinx and Passage to Bangkok and Something for Nothing are probably, those three are probably the most directly clearest examples of good heavy metal out of Alex that we get.
77's Farewell to Kings, Close to the Heart Cinderella, top 40 album. It's got a successful single. What do you think about this album?
I remember as a kid when we got this album, I was disappointed with it because it was less heavy, or is more proggy, and the heaviness. You almost hear like a separation of the instruments. So you're hearing almost like a jazz ensemble in a way on that record. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Even when they're heavy, it doesn't have a wall of sound filled in heaviness the way 2112 is. I think that's my problem with it. And plus it is just less heavy overall, and more proggy. So I remember being disappointed with it, not liking it as much. The drummer in me was still, hey, there's a lot of cool things to learn on here. This is fun. But no, they were just getting a little wimpy, as we would say at 14 years old.
And then the Trees from 78's Hemispheres, and that was the last album of the 70s. And I love that, they're in the disco era. Music was to get people on the dance floor, right? And Neil's writing a song about a conflict between oak and maple trees in a forest, and they insist on being treated equally. In the end, they destroy each other in the process. That's a classic Neil song.
Yeah, and it's political. It's about unions, and so that's cool. And what I like about this album is I felt a little bit of the heaviness came back. There's just a little more beefiness to the guitars and the bottom end. And my favorite Rush song of all time is on it, Circumstances.
Neil later said that Ayn Rand no longer spoke to him, saying he was a kid then. So it's interesting to read that quote from him because you see the transition he makes in the 80s. His lyrics become more introspective, I suppose, more of questioning his own existence, mankind's existence. Why are we here? Because we're here, right? Even his appearance went from long hair, mustache to clean-shaven, short haircut. He was evolving, and the music reflected that. The 70s Rush, more of a sci-fi rock era?
Yeah, and punk comes along, new wave comes along. There's more they are growing rapidly. He's starting to write shorter songs, on more, different defined topics. But yeah, you look at Cygnus X1 and the whole concept of hemispheres and the old massive Greek mythology thing and the reason versus art. So he's covering all these lofty things at this point, and then it starts changing. You get Spirit Radio and Entre Nous, Emotion. You get Free Will. He discusses free will. So yeah, something that always bothered me about Permanent Waves is it's a really short album. I think it's about 36 minutes long or something. I wish they would have just put one more song on it. But yeah,
you're right. 35 minutes, 35 seconds. That's the
wow,
the length here, according to Wikipedia.
So basically they are greatly evolving and they're so intellectually curious, musically curious. So they're early adopters of synthesizers and electronic drums and stuff like that. And as we all know, Neil quite liked what the Police was doing, so he starts incorporating the busyness on the hi-hat. He never sounded anything like Stuart Copeland. I don't know. There's almost too much discussion about how Stuart Copeland's influence is there, because Neil is still a very rigid, structured drummer. And even when he did any of this hi-hat sort of stuff, it was always in a more structured way. Stuart sort of swings on the hi-hat. He incorporates it into the groove, and it's more of an independent, a four-limb, one arm, the hi-hat arm independence thing. Neil is more like, I'm going to do some busy hi-hat. And that's really the only, and then the reggae influence, I suppose. There's the white reggae influence that Police, so Police bring in reggae, and then I guess Rush is a little bit derivative in bringing in the reggae influence. But I think that's really all the Police there is to Rush.
Well, I suggest anybody who's listening to this, if you haven't yet, check out Martin's podcast. It's History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. Great podcast for fans of rock music. How did that all come to be?
I was on one of the bosses there, Christian. I went on his podcast, and then the next day he asked me, "Hey, do you want to do a podcast for us?" So I quickly came up with this concept. I wanted something really streamlined where I didn't have to schedule and rely on other people and worry about how it's going to sound on Skype and all that. These guys are really serious about how good it sounds. I mean, Christian actually even came out to Toronto and met with the three of us who have podcasts here. And came to my office and tweaked my sound, so I've got really good audio on it. So yeah, all I do is come up with an idea that I want, an argument I want to make, and prove it with 5 little song clips, and then talk about it. And it's 20 to 29 minutes. It's a lot of fun. I just get inspired on the walk to work and say, okay, right, I got to knock one off. I got to put one in the can so it's ready to go. Comes out every Tuesday, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm trying to stay away from doing anything too obvious like Judas Priest in 5 songs or anything stupid like that, right? I've had one-on-one band, and it was Metallica, but it was about the Metallica productions, right? So I always want to have a little bit, and then some of them are really wacky, like, hair metal bands that sound like Led Zeppelin, or I have one called Go to Vancouver and Try Harder, about how all these big bands, when they got clean, they and their career was going down, they'd have to go record an album in Vancouver and stuff like that, right? So they can be fairly arcane. Have one on Martin Birch. But yeah, hopefully I won't run out of ideas. I also have a very active Facebook page on it, and I have a lot of great smart music fans there who give me a lot of good ideas.
That's cool. And it's part of the network Pantheon. There's plenty of great music podcasts there to check out.
Yeah, that's the whole idea with Pantheon. They want this to be only music, so it's just a whole bunch of like super smart music geeks and nerds and who know a lot about music, and they want to keep it themed that way. They're really serious about growing this and getting the ad revenue in and shopping it around. And they've had a lot of indication and a lot of research saying, podcasts are getting to be a huge thing, but music podcasts probably have the most sort of excitement attached to them.
All right, Martin, thanks so much.
Cool, man. We'll talk to you later.
That'll do it for this episode of Booked on Rock. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Find us online at bookedonrock.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/BookedOnRockPodcast. On Twitter at BookedOnRock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks as always for listening. And join me again next time for a brand new episode of Booked on Rock.